Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com, and as I stand here in the year 2020 in this very, very dilapidated recording studio, we're experiencing a sudden and rather refreshing trend sweeping across the video game industry. That being that video game developers are saying no to their set deadlines and are instead delaying their games in order to, air quotes, get it right. Now this approach has to be commended, on paper at least, because it's saying to their audience that we don't want to put out a less than stellar game. And you know what? I'd rather wait a few months more for something that might make my entire year. However, this isn't to say that it's always a good thing, as one need only remember that horrible looming spectre that is the video game publisher to know that if more time has been given, it's likely not just because EA or Activision were feeling generous, there has to be an ulterior motive. And that's also to say little of the dreaded crunch, which might mean that developers are being worked beyond reasonable hours and now with a good deal of extra pressure on them to actually deliver. And worse still, what if it all goes wrong? What if the extra wait wasn't worth it? Well, that's what happened with these 10 games, so with no more delay on my behalf, even though I am definitely always worth the wait, I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games delayed to get it right that still got it wrong. Number 10, Duke Nukem Forever. It may be strange to think of nowadays, but once upon a time, Duke Nukem Forever was the game that everyone wanted to play. However, development hell kept what turned out to be a rather disappointing game from the hands of fans for nearly 14 years, although all things considered, maybe this was a blessing in disguise. The development began all the way back in 1996 with a release date penciled 2 years later. It didn't arrive until 2011, and in that time, the industry moved on. Duke, however, did not. In 2009, Take-Two Interactive, who at the time owned the publishing rights to the title, filed a lawsuit against 3D Realms for failing to finish development in a designated time frame, and after all of this, it was eventually completed by Gearbox. As you might expect from a game that's had more hands on them than a touchscreen, this led to a massive identity crisis for Duke, and the finished product failed to pop anything other than its own bloated self of self-assured greatness. Number 9, Too Human. Too Human was initially announced back in 1999 and intended for a release on a PlayStation system, but developer Silicon Knights soon partnered with Nintendo and suddenly the game was slated to be a GameCube exclusive. 5 years later, not much had happened and the developer announced a new partnership with Microsoft and suddenly Too Human was now a 360 game. And then, well, nothing until 2008. Imagine that, being in development for so long that an entire console generation passed you by. Throughout this duration, the plot was scrapped and reformed several times over, and while its focal concept was to mix Norse mythology with a cyberpunk twist, the end result was just too confused to be an emotional powerhouse that it sorely wanted to be. The game wanted to change the status quo, but became so weighed down with clunky mechanics and a lack of anything interesting outside of its aesthetics that it quickly became a bargain bin mainstay. In fact, the only really interesting thing about this was that the developers tried to sue the makers of the Unreal Engine, blaming their lack of support for their missed launch windows, but then got countersued themselves because they used assets from a version of the engine that they didn't have a license for. Maybe they should have waited a little longer to check out those things, right? Number 8, Alien Colonial Marines. Alien Colonial Marines was, to put it bluntly, a massive disappointment. It was intended to debut in autumn 2012, but didn't arrive until February 2013, and its promised unique twist on the formula boiled down to the most generic first-person action that you could find. It was clear that the developers had taken some notes from the game's cinematic counterparts, but poor design choices and mechanics led to its ruins. For a franchise built around horror, this became a laughing-stock comedy affair. This was largely a consequence of poorly scripted AI where the xenomorphs aimlessly wandered around posing little to no threat whatsoever, and we were told by the devs that the delay was to improve the game and deliver the best graphics possible. What that meant clearly was buggy AI and graphics that looked so much worse than the teaser vertical slice that they showed off, leading to fans to chastise this for being something that should have definitely been forced out of the airlock. Number 7, Mighty Number 9. Mighty No. 9, despite being a new IP, had actually got a lot to live up to, being heralded as a spiritual successor to the Mega Man series and coming from the mind of Keiji Inafune. Yet things didn't start well, as the title was subject to not 1, not 2, not 4, but 3 delays across its time. One of the biggest challenges the development team faced was a product of the game engine that they were using being no longer supported by its creator. This led to them having to configure parts of the engine themselves, and what this meant for us is that the game looked like utter tosh when it was first released. With all this time and all that insane amount of money that was drawn in from Kickstarter, it was assumed that the title would be more polished than my bald head, but unfortunately this was a bare bones experience that looked awful. Again, like my bald head. It felt like a cheap cash-in, and it was made only worse when you know that money from this game's development allegedly went into funding other projects, with the devs being asked to work on them as well as Mighty No. 9. You know what? Finish your first tire fire, Keiji. Come on, you cheeky whippet. Number 6, The Last Guardian. The Last Guardian was an extremely promising release and on paper looked like it was doing something truly refreshing, a title based on friendship and trust between a youngster and a lovable creature. And so, because of this, we too gave The Last Guardian our trust, allowing the game to slip from 2007 to a release date of 2016, with the hope that things would turn out for the best. Yet, despite having years and years of work poured into it, it was clear from the get-go that its mechanics and controls belonged in the past. The protagonist's companion Trico may have looked aesthetically pleasing, but the AI controlling it caused constant issues when solving puzzles. Likewise, the camera was fickle to control and character animations would detract from the gameplay negatively. There is a lot to love about this game, but the lack of polish and frustrating controls hampered this experience so much so that I doubt many of you even remember it, and even less actually played it. Number 5, Daikatana. Daikatana is one of John Romero's greatest failures, and to be honest, I love reminding him of this fact, because you know what, anyone who tells me that their game is going to make me their bitch is really going to need to stick the landing, and here it did a bloody nosedive. And this game should have done well, as Romero and his team had worked on the likes of Quake and Doom, so they had the pedigree alright, but then the telltale signs began to show. Delay after delay meant that the game that was originally scheduled to release in 1997 dropped in 2000. Given the lengthy development cycle, expectations were extremely high for this project, but the game was a broken mess when players got their hands on it, and now ranks amongst one of the worst games, and say it with me kids, of all time. NPCs died just by looking at them, weapons just hurt you as much as it did its enemies, and levels were just so badly designed and convoluted that players got lost on the very first handful of stages. In short, it was a game that many wished had not just been delayed longer, but had never been released. Number 4, Perfect Dark Zero. Perfect Dark Zero is another classic example of a game being repurposed for multiple platforms only to end up being a catastrophic disaster. The development began back in 2000 when it was intended to be released on the GameCube. However, Microsoft entered the fray and purchased Rare, which led to the development changing focus to make the game for the Xbox. Soon after, rumors about the Xbox 360 prompted another shift, and so Perfect Dark Zero was repurposed again for this new console. The delay was intended to ensure that the game would be in its best state and playable on the best console available at the time. But the development schedule became rushed to guarantee that it would be a launch title, and can you see where this went? Of course the game didn't live up to expectations, and I mean, it wasn't a terrible title, but it was nothing like its previous game, and it left fans to remark that it had lost its soul in the transition between publishers and platforms. Sad times. Number 3, Days Gone. Days Gone is a much more recent example of a game delayed to improve the final product, but still managed to produce a rather lackluster result. Again, this game isn't the pits, but it just wasn't the game changer that it could have been. When the announcement broke about the title being delayed for 2 months, it was implied scheduling was the cause. But in the same announcement, it was stated that developer Bend's studio would take time to further polish the game. But it's not evident to what they were trying to polish, however, because the overall experience was just bland. It was a competent zombie game, an okay open world adventure. I mean, the writing was, well, it wasn't going to win any awards, but altogether it just meant that this title was just middle of the road. It didn't help that there was a series of bugs that plagued the story, which later had to be addressed with patches. You'd think with time off to fix such things that it wouldn't be such an issue, but it looks like the Days Gone devs had spent their extra days on something else. Number 2, Red Dead Redemption 2 on PC. Now make no mistakes, Red Dead Redemption 2 on console is a masterpiece. It is possibly the pinnacle of Rockstar's endeavours and will be forever remembered as one of the greatest releases ever for the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. But the PC copy, however, which arrived a year after its console counterparts, it wasn't good. Technically though, this wasn't a delay and more like a delayed release, but still with that time on their hands and a rabid fan base that would have waited until the end of time for it to finally move to PC, Rockstar really dropped the ball with this release. We were promised new story mode content and visual upgrades, but what we got was a situation where players couldn't even load the bloody game, and when it did run, it was shoddy at best. Now true, this game will get better over time, but with all of this extra leeway afforded to this port, why was it released in such a wonky state? And the Metacritic user rating? Well, that speaks for itself. And number 1, Brink. Bethesda was known for developing or publishing stellar video games back in its glory days, and in fact you'd be hard-pressed to find a bad one in their library at that point. I wish I could say the same now, eh? Brink, however, was such a stinker. It was delayed multiple times, but this didn't stop Bethesda and Splash Damage from releasing a product that was far below their standards. Chief among its numerous appeals was the free-running mechanics, which seemed novel for a video game. In reality, they ended up being a novelty that wore off pretty quickly. The momentum of movement completely fell apart when it came to the actual gameplay and gunplay, which was just so boring and spongy that battles felt like slogs, and these were not helped in the slightest by the terrible AI. The story was incredibly underwhelming and short, with no actual main drive, and on a personal note, I hate it when video games like this just chuck you into multiplayer maps and tell you that that's the story. Give me something more, give me some new areas please, so I can be a little bit more immersed. It's not hard. And it's a shame because Brink had a very interesting art style and premise, but it was let down everywhere else. And when Bethesda saw how poorly it was selling, they simply pushed Brink off a cliff and wiped their hands clean. And there we go, those were 10 video games delayed to get it right that still got it wrong. I hope that you enjoyed that, my friends, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. You can go follow me at RetroJ with a 0 over on Twitter, but before I go, I just want to say one thing, and that is, sometimes it is a very good idea to take a step back from situations that are causing you grief. We noted here about times that developers said that they were going to take some time off to get it right, but came back and unfortunately got it wrong. But that shouldn't be a reason to not take a look at your own life and weigh up things in terms of what you can control and what you can't, because you might find that you're wasting a ton of energy on things that you can't control, and you might, like these developers, come back further down the line and end up making unfortunate mistakes again. So do yourself a favor, give yourself a break, be kind to yourself, and weigh things up so that you can make sure that your energy is best spent in the right places. Take care of yourself. Big love from me to you. As always, I've been Jules, you've been awesome, never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.